The Industrial Revolution is the defining moment in the history of economic development. It was in this episode the remarkable transformation in living standards that we've seen in many parts of the world over the past 250 years commenced. What happened in the Industrial Revolution was a growth in knowledge about how to produce what we call technological change on a scale that was historically unprecedented. And this wasn't a short-term phenomenon. It was persistent and it accelerated over time. The episode that we call the Industrial Revolution is generally regarded as occurring between 1760 and 1830. This is when the first burst or phase of technological innovation occurred. The innovations that occurred during this period that are usually most identified are developments in the use of steam power, developments in methods of producing cotton and producing iron. But there were many other innovations as well. When we look at the evolution of living standards during this period of the Industrial Revolution, it's not immediately evident that there was a revolution. In this table, I've presented data on GDP per person, life expectancy at birth, adult literacy, and annual work hours. And you can see in the period from 1760 to 1820, there was some increase in living standards, but that increase wasn't large compared to what came after. There was an increase in life expectancy at birth, but again, that was a smaller increase than what was to come in the years after. Similarly for adult literacy. And if you look at annual work hours, then you see that, in fact, annual work hours increased in the period of the Industrial Revolution. So you might ask, well, was this really a revolution? I think the answer to that question is yes, that this was a seminal event in the history of economic development. And there are 6 reasons why I think that's the case. The first reason is that even though the rate of increase in economic growth in standard of living was slow by the rates we're used to today, historically the rate of increase in economic growth during the Industrial Revolution was still rapid. Research by Stephen Broadberry and co-authors suggests that in the period from 1270 to 1700, the rate of growth in GDP per capita in England was about 0.2% per year, whereas in the period from 1700 to 1870, it was 0.5% per year. So even though that's slow by modern standards, that was still a considerable increase on what had been the case for 400 to 500 years before. Secondly, it has to be remembered that living standards might not have increased rapidly, economic growth might not have increased rapidly, but this was a phase where there was also very rapid population growth. So the English population doubles in the period from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. In this graph, I've shown the growth in GDP per capita as the blue line from 1700 to 1860, and the growth in population as the purple line, and the growth in the total size of the economy as the red line. And you can see the point that there was considerable population growth in this period from, in this graph, 1775 up to 1820. Now in the Malthusian era, that increase in population would have inevitably led to a decrease in living standards. Yet in this period, there was a large increase in population and living standards actually increased by a small amount. The economic historian Hans-Joachim Voth has calculated that based on the amount of population growth there was during this period, if this was still the Malthusian era, then it's likely that living standards in England would have actually decreased by about 10 to 20%. The third reason why I think it's right to say that this was a revolution is that there was rapid growth in productivity in sectors where technological change was occurring. In this table, I've taken some numbers from research by the economic historian Greg Clark about sectoral level productivity growth from the 1760s to the 1860s. And I've focused on areas where new technologies had their biggest effect in the Industrial Revolution. So for example, textile production, cotton and wool production, iron and steel production, and transport, which benefited from the introduction of steam power. And you can see that in all those areas, the rate of productivity growth is much higher than the average rate of growth of 0.5% about during this period. It's at the level that would be considered reasonable by modern standards. The reason that that doesn't translate into a high overall rate of productivity growth is that these sectors of the economy only accounted for about 20% of the economy during this time. So even though they are experiencing rapid productivity growth, rapid growth in knowledge about how to produce, the effect on overall productivity growth was muted because they only made up about 1/5 of the economy. The fourth reason why I think it's right to think of this period as a revolution is you need to think about what came after. So this was an episode where there was an initial burst of technological change which was sustained afterwards. In fact, technological change accelerated after this period. This was different to what had happened in earlier periods of technological change. So in the 15th century, for example, you'd had the invention of printing, you'd had major developments in technologies for shipping and navigation, you'd had the invention, for example, of gunpowder. Yet in previous periods, such as the 15th century, this burst of technological change had petered out. In Britain and Europe, in the Industrial Revolution, the technological change continues on. It's also important to remember when judging the rate of growth in productivity and output in Britain during this period, that Britain was the leader. So unlike countries which began their development phase later in the 19th or 20th century, Britain didn't have other countries around the world from which it could draw a stock of technological innovations. It's also the case that market size at the time, compared to what would be the case in the 20th century, limited the scale on which research and development for innovation could occur. Fifth reason is that this was a period of major structural change in employment. So the Industrial Revolution continued the trend of a shift of employment out of agriculture, and it continued a trend of employment shifting into industry. So here I've presented an index of industrialisation from 1750 through to 1900. The blue line is the United Kingdom, the purple line is Europe, and you can see in the period from 1750 to 1830, England, and then continuing on to 1860, the United Kingdom, England, moving ahead of Europe in the extent to which employment was concentrated in industrial type jobs. This was also a period where urbanisation continued apace. So here I've got the percentage of the population living in urban areas, and you can see that sort of from 1700 to 1800 that increases from about 15% to 25% and then up to 40% by 1850. By the 1850s, 1 person in 6 in England, for example, lived in London, and 1 in 6 jobs in manufacturing industry were located in London. So at this time there were whole manufacturing industries which were located in London. The printing industry in Fleet Street, Precision Instruments in Camden, and the furniture making industry in Tottenham Road. There was the gigantic Albion flour mills which had the Bolton and Watt steam engine powering them, which employed 500 people on the Thames. And there were the large shipyards at Poplar and Millwall, which employed over 15,000 people. So the Industrial Revolution really brought about a change in what jobs people were doing, and it brought about a change in where they were living. The Industrial Revolution also created changes in family labour supply and introduced what we call the factory system. So during the initial stages of the Industrial Revolution, there was a reasonably large number of jobs for women and children in factories, and also women still had jobs available to them they could do from the home. But as the Industrial Revolution progresses, as more and more jobs come to be in transport sector, for example, train transport, iron and steel production, machinery production, and as there's less opportunities for females to take jobs which are in the home, which forces families to think about the choice between females providing services in the household versus working in the formal labour market to earn income for the family, we start to move towards what's often called the male breadwinner model. So the constraints on female employment which started to exist meant that increasingly in families the male's wage was the primary source of income. Also, where work took place was changing. So by the 1840s, 2/3 of output in the cotton industry was produced in factories and 1/3 of output in the iron and steel industry. Having factories concentrating employment in one location meant that employers could take advantage of economies of scale from the large capital equipment which they needed to do modern manufacturing. It meant that they could exert greater control over the quality of output that was being produced. It also meant that in a variety of ways they could exert more control over their workforce. So there was a shift towards employment being located in factories. And that obviously had huge effects on the nature of the employment relationship between workers and bosses, and it also created management as a new skill that was required. So I think the Industrial Revolution was a major event, as I said at the start of this section, the defining moment in the history of economic development, and so it's certainly worth spending some time thinking about it. And that's what we'll be doing in the rest of this lecture. In the next part of the lecture, I'll talk about what were the inventions that made up this Industrial Revolution, this initial stage of technological development that's occurred in the last 250 years. Then I'll talk about why the Industrial Revolution occurred. I'll talk about a question that's intrigued economic historians, why the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in China. I'll talk about what contemporaries made of the new economy and how the kind of issues they raised about this new economy are really issues that have continued on through to the present in our thinking about market-based capitalist type systems of organising economic activity. And then I'll finish up by talking about how the Industrial Revolution spread from England to other parts of Europe.